All right, we are joined. He's back, the ethical skeptic, aka Roger Cunningham. This time, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Darren, Graham, thank you. A pleasure to be here. It's been almost 2 years, I think, is what
Yeah,
you were indicating. Yeah.
yeah, this is great. And I mean, I feel like you've done so much more work, posting lots on X, lots of interesting theories. It seems like things are opening up. Darren and I always talk about this. We feel like we're in the age of reveal. Your work, among others, that it just feels like they can't sort of keep the lid on. So interesting times.
Yeah, absolutely. They have a new challenge with regard to two things. One, of course, is the internet and X in particular being a medium for voices that had been traditionally squelched. But in addition, AI, AI has turned out to be a little bit more of a balancing mechanism than I thought it would be. As long as you get past the initial doctrine that it spews at you and say, that doesn't have any evidence, it's just something that's repeated, or pluralistic ignorance as it's known. So show me the studies, and they can't produce the studies, and then you offer up to them, studies to counter the argument that AI makes. AI will acknowledge that you have a good solid argument and then pursue what I call per hoc adidum. It means Latin for along this line of reason. Walk with me along this road for a while. It's a useful mental discipline in science. And if you find people who cannot do a per hoc adidum argument, or follow you along a path, or can't steel man your argument, or follow the critical path of logical calculus, getting into the jargon here, then those people are closed-minded before they approach the science, as well as being unskilled at dealing with philosophy in
That's
general. But
yeah, that's good.
AI has changed that landscape significantly, and those, an additional factor is, archaeologists in the past could inundate you sort of like a Gish Gallop. They could inundate you with a lot of the jargon and terminology out of their discipline, and you wouldn't be your competition was more tactical. You had to go look up all those terms. Well, AI allows you to weed through that stuff in a matter of a minute or two, so you get to the core of the archaeologist's argument and you can counter them back, especially if you are trained in systems science and engineering. If you are trained in deductive investigation and have decades of experience, all of a sudden archaeologists are looking like sociologists more than scientists.
When
Well,
you
yeah,
walk,
and it also makes it easy to take those ideas and then turn them into a good visual medium for the first time, right? Whereas before you could sort of envision these sort of slides and these sort of things, but they'd have to be very rudimentary. Whereas now you can also use AI to make these slides that really get the point across in a couple of pictures, or they can really sort of expand on an idea that shares well on social media and stuff like that.
when you
Yeah.
walk when you walk along that when you walk along with the AI, does it feed back into itself? Like, I've heard both stories where it doesn't take that into account, but is it learning from you when you do that?
Your instance of that AI is learning, and I pay the fee for Chat GPT, and I think we're on 5.2 as the iteration now. It has gotten progressively better, but once it understands something in the discourse between you and its instance, that's the session that is running just for you. It keeps that intelligence, that knowledge, that epistemology throughout the remainder of your discussions. And sometimes it'll lose a placeholder or a bookmark or a reference that you previously discussed. But if you remind it, it'll go back and capture that and bring it into the conversation. So I'm finding ChatGPT, when I finish a session with ChatGPT and we look and we steel man the narrative from archaeology, and then we look at the 411 recitations and the logical structure of ECDO theory, ChatGPT sides 95% with ECDO theory, but the problem is that's only that instance. If you go and log in as someone else, or you go to your friend's house and say, "Hey, log in and ask ChatGPT about this," it's going to be amnesiac, and it's going to go back to the default again. You have to exercise that entire argument again to get it convinced in that quote instance with your friend. But still, it's an ally through the whole process in general.
Well, it gives you the ability to sort of bounce it off it. And it almost helps that it wants you to be wrong. I find that helpful because in a lot of the subjects we're using it for, it doesn't want to help. It wants to just kind of poo-poo you on a lot of stuff. So
Yeah.
for what you're using it for, that's probably especially helpful because you're trying to plug holes.
I have tested ChatGPT, putting in the mix an insistence on something I know is wrong, and logically framed an argument to support it, although it would be casuistry. It was a pseudo argument that I propped up just to see how it would respond. And it stood its ground. I really liked that. So when I get into the depth of probably 90% of the ECDO arguments, and I've got the ample recitation, background to support it, it follows along, and it doesn't give certainty to my deductive and inductive inferences, but it gives a high probability. I put some of the quotes in the articles I've written. It ascribes a high probability to the either the possibility or the likelihood of ECDO theory being real.
Before we get on to that, you mentioned X opening up, but you're still throttled on there. I saw a post recently. You're talking
Yeah.
about how throttled you are in there. Do you want to touch on that before we move into the theory?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a tactical factor in that. In other words, it's not active throttling, in that I've got two user bases. Number one would be the COVID reader base, or colleagues, as I call them. It's a portmanteau of follower and colleague, so it offers some respect, to those people who are genuinely interested. Their interest in their acumen make them colleagues, if you will. But by splitting between COVID vaccine and COVID analysis, and that being sequestered or squelched or throttled, and then having another part of my follower base being ECDO theory, challenges against climate change, which certainly challenges another imperious narrative similar to COVID policy. When you split those two camps in half, you're going to get an automatic throttling statistical reduction. That one's innate. It is not done by the platform. That's just the reality of the ethical skeptic. You've got a foot on either side of the stream. Makes it a little bit hard to walk along when you're straddling a stream. So, but there is an intrinsic throttling that remains, that is an artifact of how the algorithms manage X, and how X in particular manages the ethical skeptic. You can see that reflected into a curve that goes back up and through a lot of the ECDO analysts, all the way through Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock. You can see the curve begin to loosen a little bit as researchers get more prominent. But when you get to me, pretty much if you map out all the people who are throttled, I'm usually on the most throttled end of the spectrum, even given that split. If you just focus on ECDO, or you just focus on COVID analysis and COVID vaccine skepticism, inside each of those camps, I'm also the most throttled. Why that is, I don't know. I know that the former CEO, before Elon bought Twitter and then renamed it X, Jack, he followed me, and only followed, I can't remember, it was something like 240 accounts. I think there was a protective factor there with Jack following me. I never got canceled off the site, which was odd. But the algorithms were still able to play behind the scenes regardless of that following.
That's kind of what I was wondering, if it was left over and it needs to be manually adjusted. Like there's these, I could be totally off, but I feel like there's these old settings from before it opened up that are still maybe in there, but I don't know.
There's definitely old settings on our account, because we don't get any traction on anything ever. And we were deleted for like 2.5 years. So I'm sure that plays a role in it. So it's like we're just in a separate jar. We're in a different sandbox altogether. That just sort of like, so there's some intermingling between the two, but that's because again, if people want to go back, the other episode was 640, where we kind of talked about the karst erosion on the pyramids and stuff like that. But at that time, we didn't really get into ECDO itself, and the Pillar 43 stuff was sort of fresh. So, it's been a wild 2 years for you. It's been exciting to watch and come along, because, I like Davidson stuff, and I like Carlson stuff, and I like Hapgood stuff, and there's the Chan Thomas stuff. I've always had this thought that the crust has to move around. It seems like the most natural explanation for fossil beds and for oil deposits, if that's how oil is actually made. I'm on the fence, but it just seems to make the most sense, and where these poles have moved, or where the ice caps have moved around and things like that. So it's been wild to sort of watch this theory come together, because it really does seem to bridge a lot of the different sort of things we've been following here for 13 or 12 years now, 12 and a half years, and kind of bring it all together. I mean, right now I would say this is sort of the leading contender, is sort of a mix between yours and Randall's and David's and stuff. And I do have some questions about that in the sort of deeper end of the pool that we can get into a little bit later, but we should probably start a little closer to the beginning, maybe a little more entry level for the people who don't even know what we're talking about when we say ECDO.
And maybe a warning.
Yeah.
Or maybe trigger warning, viewer discretion is advised.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not an easy topic, being a systems engineer and applying systems engineering to solve daunting problems in markets, corporations, value chains. It's a complicated practice, but these are also complicated domains in which I apply it. I think ECDO, what I've got here is a picture that we could probably begin with. See if I can get it to come up on the screen. For some reason, it's struggling to come up.
Yeah, you have to share again, I think.
Yeah, I do. But the picture's struggling to come up on my screen as well. If I can get it up here. Yeah, let's see. I'll go ahead and share it and see if it may pull it in its entirety. But really, ECDO is exothermic core mantle decoupling Zhenebekov oscillation theory. That's ECDO. And even that title is not sufficient to fully describe the theory, but the theory name would have been 3 sentences long if I'd hit it in a Wittgenstein format or discipline. So people critique the name and say, well, it's not. And I'm like, well, yes, but I can't make the name longer than that. That's about all we could stuff in one acronym or name. There we go. Now I think it's coming up.
Just while you're doing that, a couple comments here. If you send the ethical skeptic good data on X and it is truthful, he will add it to his ECDO article. If it works with the theory, he is constantly finding things that are predicted to be the case by ECDO. So
that's correct. For some reason, is it part of the screen's coming up? Is it?
Yeah, no, this looks good. Yep.
It's sort of getting bigger now. Yeah,
there we go.
There we go.
It was scaled differently than my source web page, so that really messed things up. But basically, the biggest challenge is this: that a lot of people they confuse two different types of georotation anomalies. Georotation means the Earth, rotates our 24-hour day. That's a georotation itself. That's really what we call state one, what we're in today. And you can see it on the left-hand side of this. And is it filling the page pretty well?
Yeah,
it looks like it is. Yeah. So on the left side, what we've got there, the GR is the georotational, that's true north. It points to the star Polaris. We also have the magnetic moment in purple on this leftmost panel or image here. And that's the magnetic north. And the difference between those is variation. Variation traditionally, I think in Nathaniel Bowditch, American Practical Navigator, variation was 11 degrees at Norfolk. And it was that way for a long, long time. When I took basic navigation courses at Georgia Tech, when I was in Navy ROTC, we study navigation back when I went through. We studied it very, very deeply, and we had the exact same variation between magnetic north and true north as Nathaniel Bowditch did, or Bowditch, whatever you want to pronounce it, when he wrote American Practical Navigator, which is the source document for much of the Navy in terms of navigation, or stood at that time. It hadn't changed for 250 years. Then all of a sudden we noticed in 1973 that, and even more so in the 80s, that true north, magnetic north up and took off out of Canada across the top of Greenland and is headed like a banshee into Russia. And that's a significant change. So variation all of a sudden is not a guarantee inside your navigational practices. There's a conversion that you do, I think it's CMD TAE or something like that, that allows you to convert between true north and magnetic north if your true compass goes out and you need to manage or navigate magnetically. There's a conversion between the two. But suffice to say, they're two different things represented by the purple pole here and the red pole here. That's what we call state one. That's what we rotate in right now. If that purple axis, and I bring it out to the front of the image here so that it has a little bit more pronounced perspective here. That's a geomagnetic excursion. And then that is what we theorize possibly precipitates the follow-on, which would be called a true polar wander. And you can see it here in this third panel. And that's called state two. That's where we have a different North Pole geographically on Earth, but that pole still points at Polaris. So it's a different type of rotation than we see with the planet Venus or the planet Uranus. Those have, and this confuses people the most, and naturally so, because it's somewhat abstract in terms of understanding how these two are different. That's an axial obliquity tilt. That is where the rotational pole no longer points at Polaris. This is an added energy state rotation, this state that Venus and Uranus are in, or Uranus are in. That's where the planet actually tilts, an obliquity tilt. That requires an outside impetus of energy to affect that. A lot of people confuse that with what we're describing in ECDO theory. What we're describing in ECDO theory is a zero added energy natural feature of rotating bodies called a true polar wander. It doesn't require outside energy. It just requires specific dynamics in the rotational mechanics inside that rotating body. And that's what we indeed have with ECDO theory. The reason we introduce Janibekov effect is not because the Janibekov effect causes or precipitates this true polar wander. This is state two, this third panel here. But that the Janibekov pathway or the Janibekov rotation, that 3-moment rotation, which is a natural feature of rotating bodies. You've seen those films in the space station where a wing nut flips around on its own without anything touching it or adding energy to it. It flips around on its pole naturally. That's the pathway of least resistance that the Earth takes between state one and state two. The Janibekov effect does not cause this. It acts as the pathway of least resistance along which the Earth rotates during this true polar wander. That state two ends up placing a point in southern Africa as our georotational North Pole. So Santa Claus has got to move from north of Greenland, fly all the elves and all the toys to somewhere in southern Africa and set up shop there during the period in which Earth rotates in state two. That georotational pole still points at Polaris as it always did. It's just that the outer components of the Earth have rotated around in a natural evolution of a rotating body. This is something we should have known all along, but we keep smoke screening the argument with axial obliquity tilts, which of course are very difficult to make happen. And that argument is used as a red herring, if you will, to distract from an ECDO type argument. So what we've postulated in ECDO theory is something akin to annular polar motion or Chandler wobble, as you can see those on the screen here. Those are not ECDO rotations in themselves. However, they are good indices as to, are we getting some ECDO-like effects in this true polar wander component of our georotation? So there are groups that are starting up now to track those indices and in close data monitoring so that we can see, is there something anomalous happening here? Should science be watching this? Our contention is, and our reason for proposing ECDO theory, is so that science begins to take this ECDO theory into the plurality set, to contend that it has surpassed Occam's razor, the real Occam's razor, not the fake one, from the movie Contact or Carl Sagan or Michael Shermer. That's pop skepticism. That's not actually accurate. To bring a hypothesis into the plurality set is what William of Occam spoke about. We have surpassed that point to where the ECDO argument is now necessary. It just has to be expressed with discipline so that it contrasts with its axial obliquity tilt in the fourth icon in this panel here.
So then after the shift, we'd be basically living in the third icon, right? That would be the new normal in state 2.
That's correct. The new normal in state 2 would have North America somewhere down where Patagonia is in our current georotation, our current rotation state 1. So we would have an ice age. And in fact, if you look at the footprint of the ice ages and the way they creep, if you will, they tend to follow very much this state 2 polar region arrangement.
Now, is that because sorry to interrupt you, would that be because there's a landmass at both points, so there's able to just, I feel like if you get not water at the one pole like you have in state 2, where you've got sort of the African continent and a bunch of my continent again, unfortunately. I mean, it looks like I'm just as fucked in both states, honestly. It's just going to be cold and shitty here no matter what. But I feel like you can grow way more ice on South Africa than you can right now with water at the North Pole, which would just allow the whole ice age to really take a grip on things.
Yeah, the ice, I conjecture the ice reforms more slowly than it does in state 1 because the state 2 georotation, the climate all over the Earth is very inhospitable, and it is not as what would you call it, stratified or bifurcated as our current state, because you've got a significant amount of cloud cover, you have a significant amount of volcanic activity. So the contrast between the polar regions and the tropical and subtropical and equatorial regions is much less in state 2. You don't expect to see the differential between the polar regions and the equatorial regions in state 2 that you see in state 1. So that throws us a bit of a curveball in terms of survivability, of course, but also in terms of trying to monitor the geostrata accumulation, stratigraphy, cyclostratigraphy science, and of course the ice cores. That state 2 is peculiar in that it messes with both of those indices, both of those research domains.
Does the change in the magnetosphere affect that at all, or accelerate it, or?
It does, but what we've got is under ECDO theory, and Ben and Randall also postulate this, and by the way, most of us agree about 80-90%, maybe even 95% with Ben Davidson. We agree on 80 to 95% of the tenets of ECDO theory. The only thing we disagree on are some of the specifics, but it's not enough to really make a big to-do about. I favor Ben's core argument and his entree, his segue into the causality of an ECDO rotation, I think is very strong. So I defer to Ben on that when you look at galactic current sheet, but he more focuses on the solar micronova and its impact on the core. I defer to him for that portion of the argument. I begin at the core. And the reason I begin there is because it dovetails into climate change very solidly. And we must begin the argument there in order to get this leveraged into the plurality set. In other words, get it before and discussed by science.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that other guys in other disciplines like Robert Schoch and some of these other guys are also, I mean, they're not going as far as you and Ben are going, but this micronova from the sun thing is really starting to catch steam in a few different areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I haven't researched it to back Ben up. Maybe I'll have the time someday, but right now it would be a waste of my time when he's accelerating through that very effectively. So that's why I defer to Ben. With the case of Dr. Schoch, I attended a conference I think 10 years ago with him, and we talked a little bit after hours, and most scientists and researchers are willing to offer up conjecture, and they make it clear that it's conjecture above and beyond what they'll say on stage and before the audience, and rightfully so. And really, part of the confidentiality is just keep that to yourself. Recognize that it's conjecture, but these fully, tenured and fully recognized, if they're not tenured scientists, they have to be reserved in even their conjecture. Because even if they have a good sound epistemic backing for what they're saying, they can be crucified before the scientific community. It's extraordinarily unfair, much less be accepted inside of any kind of peer review.
Can this, in this model, can it be affected by outside influence, whether that's impact or just the passing of another body? Because when I think about that wing nut floating in space, it looks to us like it's random. But there could be some sort of outside influence, gravitationally or otherwise, that maybe we're not just witnessing. So I'm just like, I guess the first question would be, is there a cycle to it? And the second question would be, do we think there's any sort of thing influencing? If it's not on a cycle, then is there an outside influence?
The Janabekov effect, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't require any outside influence. It's a natural feature of a 3-moment problem rotating body.
Can the cycle be measured on it then? Like if they watch that nut spin, is there a timing?
It's 50-50. Yeah, you're 50. If you watch that wing nut in the classic YouTube video, and there's a number of them now, but if you watch the original wing nut, it spends 50% of its time in state 1 and 50% of its time in state 2. If you can liberally apply the ECDO jargon to that wing nut spinning in space. So a body that is a true 3-moment body spinning symmetrically in space in its natural rotation state will spend 50% of its time in either state of the Janabekov effect. We don't do that, however, because this is and I make it clear in the article, this is actually a mediated Janabekov effect. And the Janabekov effect, it only dictates the pathway of least resistance. It doesn't cause the georotation. So we spend the vast majority of our time under my current version of ECDO theory in state 1, where we are now. We're geomagnetically locked, and that's why that purple pole there is aligned so closely to the North Pole, the true North Pole. We're geomagnetically locked in state 1, so we don't actually require a celestial body to fly by or some type of energy impetus, say for maybe the scalar A and phi field of the sun. We don't require the polar ice caps to melt or the oceans to rise or anything like that to precipitate this ECDO rotation. All that has to happen is the geomagnetic core to go below a certain threshold in both its permeability, that's the measure of the magnetic strength of the core, the lattice of the inner core in particular, and its declination. That's how far off of true north it wanders. And that we have right now. That's the circumstance we have right now, which is alarming a number of people. I'm staying away from prognosticating the next event because we don't have enough information to get people panicking. I don't want to cause people stress or anxiety or destroy their world or cause them to feel like that we're going to flip over in 20 years or 5 years or whatever people are predicting. That would be irresponsible of me to do that. We don't have the evidence which substantiates that. Well, all I'm saying is that happened at some point in the past. It explains and unifies the preponderance of our geostrata and oceanic and remnant isotopic data in the geostrata. These are all the archaeologist and geologist jargon that you have to look up with the help of ChatGPT. But it unifies what we've observed in our historic or history of the planet. And that's why I feel it's strong, and we can get into some of those evidences and arguments if you want.
It's had to be a strange journey because you kind of went from a comforter at the beginning when you were like telling people not to freak out because COVID wasn't that bad, to now like sort of the antithesis of that. But just to make sure I understand this first one correctly before we move on. So it seemed like the purple line, that's your geomagnetic north. Once that gets to a certain point, that's sort of the best indicator we have. So when that geomagnetic gets far enough away from where it is, where it's supposed to be, then we slip into state 2.
Yeah, I measure that along, whether for right or wrong, I measure that along a continuum of a geomagnetic excursion that occurred in 42,000 years ago. I think it's years before present. Once you get to that, the difference between BC and years ago is not much. But 42,000 years ago, we had a rather pronounced geomagnetic excursion called the Le Champ. The French name, and I believe it's the scientist who mapped out the principal measurements, the Le Champ geomagnetic excursion. It follows pretty well what Ben Davidson, it followed as a geographic progression, the pathway that Ben Davidson is outlining. So Ben is outlining a progression of the geomagnetic North Pole with a pretty high confidence. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. It's inductive in terms of inference, but he's mapping out a high confidence pathway. My contention is that the georotational pole of the Earth doesn't follow exactly the geomagnetic pathway. It does its own thing. All it's waiting for is the permission from the geomagnetic moment to do that thing. So the Le Champ excursion, if you take that as a 0 to 10 scale or a 1 to 10 intensity on that classic technique, the Le Champ being a 10, if you look back in our intermediate history since that Le Champ's excursion till now, what I'm calling the Gauss geomagnetic excursion, we are probably 9% the way through that continuum, or 1 on a scale of 1 to 10. And that's why I caution people, don't panic over this. Just like COVID, China published 3 and 4% fatality rates, and not infection fatality rates, but case fatality rates. And when I mapped those, and I was working for a client who was getting ready for COVID at the time in the industry, I mapped those for that client, and everybody in the war room that we had assembled at that time, just their jaws hit the table, including mine. And everybody was looking around there. You could see people wanting to call their families, and it was a lot of stress. And so I looked hard at the Chinese numbers because US didn't have our own numbers. We had maybe our first case in Seattle at that time, but everybody was rather puckered up, as they say in the Navy, at that point. So I began to challenge what was coming out of China and analyzing the denominator in their math, what's on the bottom of the division curve, and found that China had made some errors in categorization. And that was the reason I got behind it and said, no, this is not a 3 and 4% fatality rate here. It's a 0.26% fatality rate. And boy, it both made me popular, but I also got crucified by all the COVID official experts at the time. They're like laughing, put my icon, my ethical skeptic icon up on the screen and saying, this guy's full of crap. I got raked over the coals until April 15th, when the CDC made their estimate and came out with exactly 0.26. At that point, everybody breathed a sigh of relief and realized this is not the monster that they've outlined. It's still significant. It's still a problem. A lot of people are going to perish from this, a lot more than the flu. And it ended up being indeed 6 times more deadly than all flus, all the forms of the flu combined. So it definitely was dangerous. We were out working in the field, to counter this because it was dangerous, but it was not the danger level that the Chinese had sold to us across those early months. In this same way, we do run a risk of a true polar wander, an ECDO style true polar wander, but I don't want people to take this and start waving the flag around that we're all going to die. We're all going to die. Number one, because that's not necessarily true. And number two, even if it was true, if you were on the Titanic and it's going down and, all the women and children have basically taken the lifeboats, would you run around, skipping around going, we're all going to die. We're all going to, that would be irresponsible. Your task as a human your first task as a human is the love and fellowship of those around you. That's the only real thing that exists in this realm. Not to torture them, not to tease them, not to judge them, not to accuse them, and all these these dark things that we practice as humans, these foibles. That's not our job. And even if I see indications, we're at 9% through the Lechamp continuum, I'm not going to run around telling people we're about to die. It just causes what I call loosh. That's negative, dark emotions in people's lives. That's not my job. That's not my license. So I'm not going to go there. So I keep this separated, compartmentalized, if you will. This ECDO rotation, I believe, was the cause of the flood of Noah, Utnapishtim, Atrahasis, Ziasudra, those myths that we are handed down in history and some literature now that we found it. That's what caused this. That unifies our oral cultural histories with what we observe inside science, because in the past, there's been an enormous disconnect between what we had in the biblical literature and what science was telling us. And for me, as growing up, I had a foot in both worlds. Again, I'm straddling the stream again. I believe both. I venerated science, and I believed science because of the background work that they had done and the rational, logical thinking. But on the same side, I felt like there was credibility to the story of Noah. It did need some modification. And when we get into the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Atrahasis, when you look at those documents, all of a sudden you see descriptions of the inundation which match exactly, not only match exactly ECDO theory and the georotation proposed there, but as well unify science and what happened in this inundation. So that inundation, I project, and I've got a timeline we can look at it. It's somewhat complicated. Apologies on that, but it's a provisional timeline. It's where I sort of storehouse all the significant events that are part of my current version of the postulate. That georotation, I speculate, coincides with what we identify as the Y-DNA bottleneck. That's a period that science has identified about 5,000 to 4,000 BCE, where 19 of every 20 males on the planet perished. And, you look at that, and I've done a lot of strategies for cultures. I've done medical, pharmaceutical strategies. I've done resource strategies. I've done impact strategies on nations like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Republic of India, what would be a famine impact. And I've measured the impact of those calamitous events on my client nations and reported back to the ministries of those nations. There's no way one single classic or mundane factor killed off 19 of every 20 males globally. Not famine, not war, not disease, not patriarchy or domination or an empire. None of those things can approach. There's only one thing. None of those things can approach the magnitude of loss that happened during the Y-DNA culling. The only thing that could kill off 19 of every 20 males is a georotation with the accompanying inertial displacement of the oceans. And it happened around when ECDO theory says that the monument data begins to come into effect, and we can look at that here. The monument memory arrived somewhere right after 4400 BCE. That's when we resumed writing after a very extreme gap in human script and writing around 4400 BCE. Our DNA got culled around 4400 BCE. There are no monuments built from 4900 to 4400 BCE. All of a sudden, you see man blossom into this new post-cataclysmic society starting around 4400 BCE. Match with that the mitochondrial DNA that we see, the footprint or the diversity that is included in our female population, and you see about an 8 out of 20 culling, anywhere from 8 to 12, I believe it is, as a percentage of culling. What happened there is I conjecture that because of the patriarchal society that we existed in at that time, men who ruled and had the access to this cultural wisdom would take their house of sons, and then every single concubine or slave or other category female that they could, and they would take that remnant of survivors and bring them to whatever location they had plotted for their survival, post calamity. And so that way you ended up with a much more diverse female mitochondrial genetic arrangement as compared to a very narrow nepotistic lineage of Y-DNA compression at that time. I think that naturally explains the differential between the mitochondrial DNA and the Y-DNA. But all of those things, the script gap, the geoglyph gap, the monument gap, the cultural artifact gap, the Y-DNA gap, they all coincide on 4400 BCE. Then we see this resurgence in modern man, the society of modern man. The emergence of the Bronze Age happens right on the heels. The development of the wheel, the development of agriculture, and extensive agriculture and irrigation. And I've got on the timeline itself a map of probably the 8 or 12 key technologies that evolved right after that, when man reestablished his presence on the planet. It was almost in this later Holocene period. The flood occurred right at the end of the mid-Holocene climate optimum. It's almost as if in this later Holocene period, man was given a special provision. The Epic of Gilgamesh says, in those days, before the kingship had descended to earth, and that means before the kingship was handed off to men, that was referring to the boundary line that was caused by the flood. The flood, it was the Asudra or Utnapishtim or Noah. That's when the kingship was handed to man around 4400 BCE, and that's when we see man blossom as a culture after that period.
And it almost seems like the Adam and Eve aspect of that could be from the last time it happened. You know, they were the survivors from the Garden of Eden, is sort of them coming out of the throes of the cataclysm before that.
Yeah, it's an interesting argument, and certainly not dismissing that. It's a very plausible way to view it, because that's a natural break point. The Bible timeline places what it calls, or what the scholars call, the patriarchs, for a period of, I believe, I can't remember. It's on the timeline. We can look at it. I believe it's. Why don't I pull up the timeline?
Yeah. Let's get into it. Just so you know, you can take as much time as you need. We're not in a rush. So
let's see if I can find that here. It's in my article on the Ethical Skeptic called "Hidden in Plain Sight," where I go through all the arguments that date and place the construction of Khufu in the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, and show that none of the arguments have any scientific backing. They're all pseudo arguments foisted by, really, I don't want to say just archaeologists. It's really those who are archaeological enthusiasts who don't really understand how to prosecute an argument. They're just there to parade the narrative, if you will. All right, there we go. I think I got it. All right, another new window. There we go. So this is the timeline, and this is provisional. By provisional, I'm borrowing a word from the CDC there. It gives you some room in which to make alterations, because there's more value in me publishing the timeline so that it becomes a philosopher's stone, or a punching bag, or whatever. It's your working stone. Not everything on it is going to be correct,
right?
But its existence helps discipline your argument and your tracking of the epistemology. It's absolutely critical in this whole exercise. There, I think we got it. Tell me if this comes up okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Is it filling the screen
perfect
effectively? Yeah. You can see on here this stark division point, the human male Y chromosome bottleneck constrained 19-1. And apologies to the viewers, this is a lot of small text. I'll hopefully describe all of it. That occurred based on the calculation from the Sumerian kings list about 4413. But I had to modify some of the kings that were listed as living, 200 or 900 years. I gave those kings, it's just 3 or 4 kings that tailed off from the period of time before the kingship was handed to man on earth. If you look left of this 3 mark here, that's the golden age, or the Holocene climate optimum. During that period, man purportedly by the Bible lived, 400, 600, 900 years. I forget what Methuselah's final age was. But the patriarchs existed, according to biblical scholars, 1,656 years prior to the flood. Now, of course, that's in high question. That's a cultural history that you've got to take with a grain of salt. It's not the basis for deductive inference. You've got to take it with a grain of salt, match it to everything else. So I include it here as really a reference point. But the patriarchs all existed by that reasoning prior to the flood for about 1656 years. They existed underneath other agencies, other kingships. I don't know what term to put on it, but I call it here the golden age of Enlil, Cronus, Saturn, and the Elohim. That's a period of just fanciful mythological descriptions of the characters who ran the earth at the time. Now, to the degree that's right or wrong, I can't certify that. All I can do is label that period, this period prior to the Bronze Age, prior to the flood, with a special, if you will, asterisk categorization. It's that we roughly call the Golden Age. Something odd was going on at this time. At that time, mankind presided in this semi-nomadic era, was not a large population at all on the planet, yet across a rather long period of time, or nominally 6,443 years under this timeline construct, existed after the meltwater pulse 1b cataclysm in a stable population for a period of time. And that's when we conjecture that men, or someone equivalent to men, but we say men, built Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Seberch Tepe, all the Tepe, most of the Tepe cultures. We contend that the penultimate stone in the Queen's south shaft of the Khufu pyramid marks a star chart that corroborates 9600 BCE as the date of construction of the Khufu pyramid. That's this golden age in which the core of these older monuments were built, not the fourth dynasty of Egypt. There's no proof of that. In fact, the carbon-14 dating in the primary two studies, the Lerner study and there's a second study that were done, and they haven't really done any follow-up studies since. Those carbon-14 datings place the activity around the pyramid at 4000 BCE, not at 2450 when the narrative says the pyramid was built. So the pyramid is clearly older, far older than the fourth dynasty of the Old Kingdom of Egypt. It was not built by Khufu. Khufu does not claim to have built the Cheops of the Great Pyramid. So what we have here is a long period of time in which those structures existed. That's what allowed the karst erosion to occur on the body of the Sphinx. That's what allowed the karst erosion to occur on the lower portion of the Khafre pyramid. And I use Khufu and Khafre as titles or names or handles for these pyramids, but I am not stating that those pharaohs built these pyramids in any way, shape, or form. They did not. The Khafre pyramid has karst erosion. Karst erosion on it is erosion that occurs when limestone is no longer down in the base of the floor below the ocean where it can't be eroded. That's where limestone forms, is underneath the ocean. It's, quote, not exposed to the ocean in truth. But when limestone is forced up such that it becomes a coastline or a structure through tectonic activity, and then is inundated as a structure like the Sphinx or like the Khafre pyramid, when those structures are inundated under ocean water, they undergo a chemical process called carbonic acid erosion. That's where the carbon dioxide in the ocean, and we know there's tons of it in the ocean from climate science, that carbon dioxide dissolves the calcium carbonate chains in the limestone and basically melts it, dissolves it away. And that's indeed what we see on the base of the Khafre pyramid and on the entirety of the Khufu pyramid. That occurred during this period, this Holocene climate optimum period. And in fact, when you look at things like the Nubian egg dates to 3800 BCE, it clearly depicts the three primary Giza pyramids at Giza, at the very top of the Nile. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's the three pyramids, and it clearly depicts the pyramids without their casing stones. So that's from 3850 BCE. So we know that those casing stones were dissolved during this Holocene climate optimum.
Would that put the construction of the pyramids right at the start of the Holocene, or would they right after meltwater pulse 1b, or do you think prior to that even?
Somewhere around meltwater pulse 1b. I suspect it was just after meltwater pulse 1b, where they were in state 1 again. We had returned from state 2 to state 1.
I was going to ask that if that was something to do with the Younger Dryas too, right? The
Yes,
ECDO.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the Younger Dryas was such a rough time that the civilization that presided over this mid-Holocene climate optimum decided to build structures that accomplish various goals. And of course, we're not going to know what all those goals are. But early in that period, after mankind and whatever else was on the planet with us reestablished their function after the Younger Dryas period and after Meltwater Pulse 1b, they built this pyramid. And again, I mentioned the penultimate stone. We can look at that. It has a star chart inscribed into it. It's at an inaccessible point in the pyramid. It was brilliant in its placement. You can't get, you know, a less than scrupulous archaeologist up into that shaft to scratch a star chart on it that matches the old kingdom of Egypt. They would have done it if they could have, I suspect. But when you go up, when the rover went up and photographed what they called at the time Gantenbrink's door, that last stone shaft at the end of the air shafts, wonderful project. I loved it back in 2013, I believe. They captured a picture of this stone that's above that final stone in the shaft, and it has a star chart on it, and they published a picture of it before they knew what it meant. Just like Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe, they released the pictures before they understood what it meant. If they had understood what it meant, what it said, I don't think they ever would have released those pictures, those photos. So Zahi Hawass presided over that project at the time. His goal was to go up and grab the copper cable hanging off the door and remove that so that it looked like handles, not copper cables. That was his goal with this project. There's the name of the project, 2013 project. So what we see there on the penultimate stone is a star constellation, a set of constellations that are carved into the stone. And when you map those in Stellarium or Starry Night Pro 8, that's what I use, it's absolutely clear. That stone depicts 9600 BCE, and it's much stronger than the Khufu Cartouche argument by orders of magnitude. And plus the Khufu Cartouche argument, you can see that the ochre there is shiny. It has not oxidized. It has not penetrated into the interstitial matrix of the stone. It's an obvious fraud. But this stone, this penultimate stone at the end of the south air shaft out of the Queen's Chamber, no ifs, ands, or buts. It depicts a star chart from 9600 BCE. That places Khufu and Khafre prior to this second inundation, this inundation of Noah, Utnapishtim, Atrahasis, and Ziusudra. That's our inundation of legend. That's what we hear about in the Bible. And that's what we conjecture on this timeline occurred around 4400 BCE.
So that would put, I mean, that could put the Enoch, because it almost seems like that could put Enoch back in that time, because there seems to be stuff in the book of Enoch where they're talking about preparing for a cataclysm, and they're looking at, you could even read it as they're in Peru or they're down, you know, by Machu Picchu and Teotihuacan and these other places looking at doing it. And we've been to enough of these places, not there yet, but we've been to enough of these places to start noticing how much this cyclopean that we call architecture looks the same all over the world. The nubs of this, I mean, we've got good friends that are sort of at the forefront of that research, and it seems like wherever those nubs are, it would seem that those guys were part of one civilization that maybe knew Noah's flood was coming.
I think it's an argument that has to be placed into the discussion. Something exceptional happened during this golden age. Mankind was only a part of that. I don't know the specifics, and I don't want to make claims in that because it is all based on cultural histories, oral histories. I don't even want to call them myths because they replicate among cultures. A myth is something that one cult made up to explain, you know, their eschatology, their ontology. But when the myths pervade multiple cultures who didn't have any contact with each other, it steps out of the realm of myth and becomes more a stronger factor, which is oral cultural histories. And the commonality between those, I think, is what we use here. You are able to do some inductive inference from the commonality in those oral histories. And that's what we've done here.
Evidence of that in our lifetime with those cargo cults that sprung up after World War II in the South Pacific.
Yeah, absolutely. A good analogy to what may well have occurred during the Golden Age. But the specifics, who managed things, what happened there, yeah, we can't. All we can do is conjecture there and make it clear that we're in the realm of conjecture. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we've had people on the show that, I mean, for me to, I'll do the conjecturing because I don't have any reputation to defend. So, or any papers or anything like that. So, but I mean, we've talked to people that it seems like that there was a past civilization that maybe knew this was coming and maybe survived at some place, and some, whether it was on a moon or in space or down in the ground, where we see these underground cities in Turkey and stuff like that. And then it would have been I mean, it even gets into the Graham Hancock kind of stuff, right? Where it's these sort of survivors from that. So just to get, so that it doesn't have to get like off planet or anything, that it could just be these sort of strongholds that were able to live out the cataclysm by luck or by preparation or whatever it was. And now they're sort of finding these bands of survivors all over. And sort of those are the guys that are leading the new civilizations, because they're obviously just, light years ahead of the people who are maybe just like, if you got through it in a US military bunker would be the analogy we would have today, where not only do you get through it, you get through it with some tech and some stuff and some things that can help your journey along. And then you're just sort of come along people that are one or two generations after, that just sort of got by the skin of their teeth, floating on a log or hiding in a cave, or they're just in the right place at the right time when the shit went down.
Yeah, Darren, and there are a number of diverse survival strategies that are contained in these cultural oral histories. So it may be that some of them describe the slower return from state 2 back to state 1. In particular, when you get to the Asia Pacific region, the flood is far less violent as compared to the Americas and Southwest Asia, or the Middle East, and the Sahara, certainly. So I think
that actually, so the move from state 2 to state 1 is a lot more survivable than the move from state 1 to state 2.
That's our current construct. The theory is open so that we can modify that. That's again why this is a provisional timeline. Right now, it says that when we pass the Lechamp threshold, which is about a 3 or 4 on that scale, we run the risk of a true polar wander, and that true polar wander happens very fast. In fact, the Epic of Gilgamesh says that it happened in a day, and then the Earth spent 8 or 9 days where the ocean did sieching or seeching, or it's pronounced, where the ocean's just tossed around, just like you just jumped in your bathtub. It sloshes for a period of time, and Utnapishtim says in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it took 8 or 9 days for the oceans to cease their rocking or writhing about like a woman in labor, is how he put it, and then Utnapishtim was able to step out of the ark that he had built and begin to reestablish those animals that he had carried, and then the agriculture that he had specialized in, and reestablish that where the quote ark at that time had landed. Yeah.
Interesting. That's I mean, that opens it up a lot more, right? That opens it up a lot more for these builders to be in place to start building these things, because everything sort of stabilizes, the climate probably gets better, and you've got a lot more people that were living their life in state 2, whatever civilization got to isn't completely wiped off the map. So you get to start at 3 instead of 1, or at 4 instead of 1. Whereas when we shift back going into state 2, the chances it's more like everybody's on 1. Everything's it's upsetting the apple cart completely, and it's basically a start from scratch.
Yeah, and I think you can see that in this what is called the human script absence gap, identified here right about the time of the flood of Noah. The Vincha script existed in Eastern Europe and abruptly ended. Then we had nothing, no artifacts, no monuments, no script for about roughly say 800 years here, that gap. Then all of a sudden we have proto-cuneiform that appears. Then we have technology arriving as civilization reestablished itself. That's about that boundary line at the end of the rotation from state 2 back to state 1 is when we develop the wheel, irrigation, the calendar, agriculture, the wooden plow, kiln-fired pottery, brick, all those implements that allow civilization to flourish that we didn't have as much of in the mid-Holocene climate optimum. They all of a sudden appeared at that boundary line. One thing that's curious, though, here, Jared Diamond has a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. It won the Pulitzer Prize in the early 2000s, if I recall, maybe even earlier than that. But he outlined what I think he called the Big 14. The Big 14 were plants and animals that were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, and the Fertile Crescent is right here in this region, that all at the same time and had no genetic precursors to speak of. They just appeared alongside man, all in the same 1,000-year period, and we've really never domesticated another plant or animal since. So how did we pull that off in the Golden Age? And then how did we preserve those things through this gap in human history, this culling, this 19-to-1 culling of humans during that period? We are able to preserve the Big 16, and the Big 16 would be cattle and oxen and dogs and cats and horses and sheep and wheat and barley and corn and rye, and those staples, those helpers and staples that man existed with in the mid-Holocene climate optimum. They survived with us, but they became really, from that point on, part of our civilization after the flood of Noah here, if you will.
So Occam's razor to me would point to preparation, that it wasn't.
I think so.
They knew that shit was coming.
Yeah, I think that I don't know if there's a simplest explanation or a restriction in plurality there. There are multiple reasonable explanations for this. It's just the other explanations are orphaned. They're out there. They could explain this, but they don't explain anything else. They don't elegantly dovetail into the history of mankind. The one that elegantly dovetails into the history of mankind is this gap that I've outlined just here. Whether that's simplest, I don't know if it's simple. It's a complex explanation. So it may violate Pop Occam's razor, but it doesn't actually violate Occam's razor. It folds elegantly into the history as outlined on this timeline.
So then that looks like, but we don't know where the 6443 is state 1, right? No, that's state 2. No, that's
that's the interval between the double rotation set. You can see down here the Egyptian priests of Ptah described what had happened to Herodotus when he visited there. I believe it was 440 BC. Yeah, 440 BCE, thereabouts. Herodotus wrote what he called his histories, or an account of Egypt, I believe is book 3 in the histories. And the Egyptian priest said, thus in the period of 11,340 years, and that covers the last 2 ECDO rotations, contextually here. The priest said that there had arisen no God in human form, nor even before that time or afterwards among the remaining kings who arose in Egypt. Nor did they report that anything of that kind had come to pass. So they said mankind had been left alone in Egypt for the most part. But during this time, they said the sun had moved 4 times from his accustomed place of rising. And where he now sets, he had thence twice had his rising. And in the place from whence he now rises, he had twice had its setting. And that's their archaic way of describing 4 total ECDO rotations: a state 1 to state 2 rotation that occurred around 10,800 BCE, a state 2 back to state 1 rotation that complements that shortly thereafter. We conjecture anywhere from 50 to 400 years thereafter. So that's a double rotation, if you will. And then again, another ECDO rotation set marked 3 and 4 here on the timeline. That is the flood of Noah. Put that in quotes. It's not actually a flood. It's an inundation cataclysm. A flood is where the water rises up. And so it wasn't actually a flood. It's an inundation or displacement. This 3 and 4 here would be the second occurrence. And indeed, this matches both the time frame as well as the logical structure of how the sun rotated in the sky as developed by the priests to Herodotus in an account of Egypt. I found that pretty significant.
And the problem with this chart is that the current date is somewhat somewhat equal to the other gaps.
Yeah,
Or
I have two.
The other cycles, like we look like we're at the end of the cycle here.
I'm sitting there with my calculator and I'm running it, and I'm putting this into the graphic, and I take 4413, the Sumerian Kings list date, and I calculate off the 6,443 years, which is exactly 1/4 of the great year of the precession of the equinoxes, which is significant on all these stones. We'll see it with pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe and other pillars in the Tepe or Taz culture in Turkey. I pulled off that 6,443 years and it came out to 2030. And I'm like, oh, crap. So I make it clear that's not a prognostication. That's just a placeholder. I also have a 5,200 year interval here based on the Nubian egg depiction that is also a harmonic in here. We've already passed that date, so I have to take that one with a grain of salt. Another reason I call this provisional, it's a set of conjecture for evaluation. It is not preaching, final claims and, and truth, if you will, put that in quotes.
Yeah.
So Göbekli Tepe in this would be sort of right around number 2 almost, because don't they say that was buried right around?
Yeah, Graham. 9600 BCE is the carbon dating for the majority of activity around Göbekli Tepe. It's matched by Karahan Tepe, which is just to the southeast from Göbekli Tepe, and it's matched roughly at Seberch Tepe, which is to the southwest. So good solid dating there. The only problem is, and we can get into this, is that the actual horoscope, or if you want to call it that, or the celestial depiction on pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe is not from 9600. No, there's, again, I hate to say this, they said this in Zero Dark 30 when the young lady who discovered where Osama bin Laden was hiding out, they said, how confident are you in this argument? She said 100%, and everybody at the table rolled their eyes, and she goes, okay, I know you guys, 100% certainty freaks you guys out. And she goes, okay, 96% plus. So we're at 96% plus confidence that the asterism depiction on pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe identifies 14,800 BCE, which makes a solid argument that the activity at Göbekli Tepe in 9600 BCE was an honoring, a redeployment of those stones. It was not the original structure. The activity there, and I certainly heed the outcomes of the carbon-14 dating for the various things that can be dated. Can't date the stones themselves, but the charcoal and the organic matter that is embedded inside the activity around that structure, you can date that, just as they did with the bakeries around the Khufu pyramid. They got some peripheral dating there through that type of activity. This indeed is also peripheral. The Göbekli Tepe structure, I think, was originally in the form that utilized these pillars. And that's why we have asterisms which match to 14,800 BCE, but were reused in 9,600 BC in the most familiar form of Göbekli Tepe as we view it now.
Which would be right before meltwater pulse 1A?
Right after meltwater pulse 1B, during this period identified by Solon to our key philosopher,
Plato?
drawing a blank. Plato, yeah, goodness gracious, the most prominent philosopher. I remember everybody else but him. But Solon had
this is from your X post. I just shared the screen you see on the screen, so this is it here.
Yes,
yeah.
that's
where
a
would
good
we
one.
end up? We would end up right around that 14,000 BC if we went back sort of another 6,443 years from that timeline.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, if we go around and if we adhere to the 6,443 year construct that I have outlaid on the timeline that we just looked at, we would again intersect with that 14,800 period. And ostensibly, we would have another state 1 to 2 and state 2 to 1 set of rotations at that time. And of course, lots of legend and cultural history that we would document. So there's an argument that says they underwent a calamity, and they put the story of that calamity on pillar 43, and they documented that it was a quarter turn of the sun across the sky on that pillar. And it's, to me, it's obvious once you look at the pillars and understand what the artists were depicting, and don't look at it as, we could look at history as mythological and fanciful, but if we look at everything in history as mythological and fanciful, we're going to be the most well-informed, ignorant people that ever existed. Just because you have a description doesn't mean you have knowledge. Knowledge comes from intelligence, and you've got to look at these pillars and derive intelligence from them, not just roll your eyes in the air and preach ethereal descriptions. It was cults, skull cults, and hunter-gatherers, and symbolic, and tombs of the dead, and all these things that are pseudo arguments. They can explain anything, everything, and nothing all at the same time. Those should not be foisted first under science. Specific arguments need to be foisted first until you're forced to actually have to accept those default arguments as reality. In this case, Pillar 43 falsifies all those fanciful pseudo arguments. That's why I contend they released Pillar 43, the imagery, before they knew what it said. And that, fortunately for us, they did that.
And pretty well stopped.
Yeah.
Pretty well stopped completely. It's
What are the chances that such an important pillar would have been uncovered? I mean, that's it's hard for me to accept that these things that we're finding are so important to the planet, and they're not just little tiny culturally significant things that they were working on themselves and their tribes or whatever. Like that's what's weird to me, that we're uncovering these things that have big implications.
I have been whispered to, so it's not evidence. Please do not straw man me, the listeners, that I'm claiming this. I don't have evidence for this, but I hear in the after sessions and some of the conferences I've attended that there are disturbing artifacts that have been unearthed and were not included in what is offered to the public right now. That bothers me. That's a human rights crime, if indeed that is the case.
All over, or Göbekli Tepe specifically?
Göbekli Tepe specifically. If indeed that's occurring, that's an if, that's a human rights crime and would be subject to not only disqualification, but putting the administrators in jail or in prison, because that's an insult to mankind. The fact that they have stopped excavation there and the documentation of that stoppage is well argued in the discourse of literature and communication around the site. So it's not something that's, Lee Clare can say, oh no, we haven't stopped. Yes, you did, because there's been significant debate about that stoppage. Just because you may have a little bit of activity going on right now doesn't mean you're doing substantive exposure of artifacts there or substantive research activity. That's, I believe, and that's conjecture, why they stopped further exploration of anything significant at Göbekli Tepe. Fortunately, we got Pillar 43. Are there more Pillar 43s, in quote, that exist that help us improve our intelligence, our understanding of these pillars? I would imagine there are, possibly in our possession, but almost certainly under the ground at Göbekli Tepe. Yes.
The thing that always interested me about Göbekli Tepe as well is I find it extremely similar to the carving style of the Moai on Easter Island.
Absolutely. The belly button or the phallic hands around the waist. And they show 5 fingers. They're very meticulous about showing that they possessed 5 fingers. Well, I won't comment any further on that. But the hands brought around the front of the body were a cultural identity. Why they had to do that, I don't know. But they felt it was important enough that they had that as a motif and a practice in their iconography all across the globe. Absolutely.
And it seems like by the amount of sediment on those things that I would put those back in that 14,000 year ago sort of area as well.
I would think so. I was misled by this. Oh, we pulled a Moai stone out and we took ropes and we walked it down a pathway, showed how they could get these big heavy stones with no trees and no leverage, no crane or structure that they could use to leverage the stones. They showed how they could walk them from the mountain down to the coast where many of the statues are, until they dug up one of the statues on the hillside and showed that it had a 40 to 60 feet of it was buried under the ground. The statue was far too large to do that disingenuous rocking down the road. That was a red herring. It was a deception. It was a human rights crime is what it is. But those statues underneath the ground make it clear there are markings there we don't understand. They're communicating not just a language, but they're communicating principles. And one of those principles is the five-fingered motif of the phallus or the belly button around the front of the statues. Absolutely great point.
Do we have time to touch on some of the alignments you've been showing lately?
Yeah.
Seem to point to the different states of north.
Yeah, I think
That's just fascinating. It's every time I find alignment, it's almost like I'm convinced all over again, and then it begins to fade off, and I find the next alignment. And I'm doing this piecemeal, after hours, after work, and after travel, and 2 a.m. So I apologize. I can't do the diligence. Well, I can do the diligence. It just takes a long time to do it. We've had researchers that, have databases of 300 different monuments that are my candidate databases to draw from. I'm only about 115, 120 monuments through that database. So it's taken me some time. But the good news is, or the bad news, however you want to view it, is that these monuments are 80 to 85% of them are aligning to what ECDO theory terms as NP prime. And that's just a fancy nomenclature for North Pole prime. That means the alternate North Pole. We argued earlier, in symbolism or the symbolism that we used, that Santa Claus would have to move to southern Africa once state 2 arrived. The majority of the ancient monuments are aligned to one spot on the earth, not one spot in the sky. If they all align to, say, their local solstice or equinox or equilux or a moon variant of each of those, they would not take on these patterns. If they all align to, say, Aldebaran or one of the major reference stars or navigational stars that are in the sky, they would also not take on this profile. The only way this profile arrives is if the obsequience, and that's a term for all these azimuths arriving to one spot on the earth, that obsequience focuses in Zambia in southern Africa. And I'm going to pull up probably one or two most prominent azimuthal alignments here, if I can find it. Apologies.
We're going to Sardinia in 2027 with the tour. People can check out.
Oh, yeah.
Contact .com if they want to get in on that. But I'm excited to go and check out those Sardinia ones firsthand and kind of, it'll be interesting to stand there and look at, because that'll kind of put it into into perspective of where the north is compared to in that alternate state.
If you look at the Cathedral of Calypso, where Odysseus was held captive for 5 years under the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey. If you look at those 2 main chambers of the Cathedral of Calypso, and I've got that in the article as well. I've got the Nazca lines pulled up here. They're precisely aligned to ECDO NP prime. And we'll use that jargon here, ECDO being the theory and NP prime being the state 2 North Pole for the whole earth. So the whole earth would point to this, just as we do today. When we build roads in Russia that align north-south, and we build roads, say, in Washington, D.C. that align north-south, that's obsequious to our current North Pole. This same practice was done in 4000 BCE. The question is, why? In fact, the majority of monuments from 4000 BCE all the way to, say, 500 BCE to 500 AD, or Common Era, the majority of monuments, 80 to 85% of them, align to this exact spot, this what we call NP prime. I'm going to show you one of the key ones. This is a mystery that has existed in the zeitgeist for decades here, all the way back, at least in popular view, to Eric von Daniken's, Chariots of the Gods controversial book that came out in whatever it was, 73 or something like that.
We had Eric von Daniken on back in the day. I couldn't get
way
number off the top of our head, but he was on the show. So now, while you're pulling that up, that would, because state 2 is short, we're saying 50 to 400 years compared to state 1, and that other age was in state 1 when these monuments were getting built. That would point to a memory that they're not actually pointing to their current north when they're doing it. They're pointing to this memory of north, so that it's almost like they're trying to encode it.
That's correct. I think that's the most plausible of all the arguments there. And ECDO is written so as to accommodate, if we get further evidence that says a different progression of events happen. Certainly, that's reasonable. People can argue 2 or 3 different possibilities here. I contend right now that it's a cultural memory because the number of monuments fades off over time, and as well a little bit the accuracy on the call to true north, the azimuthal alignment of what state 2 true north would have been. It drifts off, and you can see it in the South American monuments. They hit ECDO's NP prime exactly. When those cultures migrated north through the current late Holocene period, they kept using the same azimuth, but they were migrating north, so the azimuth was off. So that tells me it's a cultural memory rather than a direct observation for many of these monuments. And indeed, we can look at the histogram that I've constructed. I published it on X today. You can see the drift off in that cultural memory. It starts right at the tail end of the state 2 to state 1 rotation back to where we are now at 4400 BCE. And number of monuments are built. And then all of a sudden it begins to taper off. And somewhere around the arrival of the Romans, we adopted a new mind. We came into the modern age, and we forgot about this sordid history and said, it's a new age, forget about all that. So we lost that cultural memory. But you can see here, the Nazca lines, there are several components that are, quote, the Nazca lines. The oldest components and the key derivatives of intelligence with regard to the Nazca lines are not the animal shapes. The animal shapes still have an argument unto themselves that we don't understand. And so ECDO leaves that placeholder open. Let's continue to deliberate that. But underneath those animal shapes are what we truly call the lines. And those were scratched into the earth or stone stacked into the earth far before the animal images or depictions on the Nazca Plateau. Key among those lines are what we call the mandala. There are a couple of these reference points. The mandala is the geodesic or the azimuthal reference that is utilized by all the lines on the plain, on the Nazca plain or plateau. This is the most prominent one, the most complete one, and this was developed first because it's the surveying reference point from which all the other asterisms or depictions or lines were referenced. And this is oriented along a primary axis of 108 degrees. You can see it here. I've got a picture taken from a scientific analysis of the mandala. I've got a photograph of the mandala itself turned into black and white aerial photograph, and then I've got the geodesic location and the bearing point of NP prime indicated on the global map to the right. You can see that the mandala is precisely aligned to ECDO theory's state 2 NP prime.
Bingo.
That's really what lit me off. And then after that, it's just monument after monument after monument. And you could say you can make an argument here and say, well, but you chose the right ordinal. Why don't you use the north-south ordinal? And I could. And in fact, I accommodated my statistical study by adding that uncertainty into the statistical calculation. And there's a method, the method I show in the study. But what happens is if you rely on that perpendicular line, your North Pole moves all over the planet. Most of the activity is around Greenland, south of Greenland, over toward Scandinavia, back toward Canada, back toward Alaska, back toward Russia. But the North Pole bears no certainty under that construct, that discipline or approach to addressing these ordinals. It's only when you adopt the ordinal that points to NP prime that the bearing begins to derive coherence. And this is a principle in navigation. I spent 40 years navigating. When you take bearing shots, axial bearing shots, as opposed to a single bearing, you take an axial. That means that the item you're shooting could be to your left or could be to your right. There's some uncertainty there. What you do to resolve that is you watch how that axis changes over time. The one that intersects and does not drift, that's the valid bearing that you use. This is the mistake Fred Noonan made in navigating Amelia Earhart. He took one shot of the Itasca signal ship with his loop antenna, and he had 2 bearings that resulted from that. He didn't take a successive shot because I think the operator got up too late, and he only got up right when he was supposed to send the broadcast. If he had waited 3 minutes and allowed Noonan to apply what's called the 3-minute rule in his navigation, Noonan would have seen that one bearing was drifting severely and one bearing had focal coherence. And he would have known to turn left to Howland Island rather than right to Gardner Island. That's the mistake that is made here. These mandalas, these reference points, these axes of these temples are not pointing to our current North Pole because the axes drift over time significantly. The only ordinal that does not drift is the ordinal that is consistently aligned with NP prime of state 2 under ECDO theory, just as you see here with the mandala for the Nazca lines.
That's interesting. I want to pull up this thing quick. This is, you kind of got to ignore all the other stuff on it. It's like a paper on continental drift and stuff like that.
Gotcha.
But I just thought it was interesting on here, mainly just because of where they show this. Let me see if I can zoom in. Where they show the location of the South Pole. Which I guess would be the North Pole in ECDO, but they're just kind of using this to explain those ice sheets over there, right? They're trying to come up with an excuse on how they can get this ice sheet to have formed in South Africa. And they've sort of got these. So does that, does this sort of negate this continental drift and stuff like that? Does that sort of explain how these ice caps have moved around instead of the continents drifting? Because that's kind of how I would look at it as well, as whenever an ice cap is formed, it's happening because it's at the pole.
It is. Under ECDO theory, our ice ages, as we call them, at least some of them, were a result of persistent state 2, and we don't have that state 2 in the ice cores because when we rotate back to state 1, state 2 ice melts off. So we don't have that record. You can't say the ice cores deny ECDO. It's not that type of evidence. It's not exclusionary evidence. So, the same argument can be made about the ice ages, but I think it supports ECDO theory that the ice in the ice ages tends to aggregate near the poles in ECDO state 2. Now, not to say that all ice ages are explained by ECDO state 2. I don't think that could be made. That argument could be made, but it certainly explains many of the progressions of ice across North America and then the Southern Hemisphere. If you take, and there's been a group that I think they held their first ECDO conference in Idaho, February of 2025. Unfortunately, I was with a client and I couldn't attend. I think that they put together a video that shows the continental drift, and that's the crust. It's not equivalent to ECDO theory. ECDO decouples at the mantle, so that would be the mantle and the crust. But if you look at continental drift theory, which is based on crust structures drifting or tectonic plates drifting, if you go back to Gondwanaland, the original state of the land geography of the earth, and then put it in forward motion very fast and roll through all of those 3 billion years, maybe it's less than 3 billion years, maybe more like 1 billion years, you can see the land masses twisting around the 2 Euler axes of ECDO theory. The west Euler axis is in Brazil. The east Euler axis is in Sulawesi near Indonesia. You can see the land masses, the tectonic plates rotating around those 2 Euler or Euler axes. It's fascinating. As well, Craig Stone, one of those researchers in that group, has put together a torsion field, a conjectured torsion field for both state 1 to state 2 rotation as well as state 2 to state 1 rotation. Place those torsion stress lines at those Euler axes, and then surmounted it, put that map on top of the tectonic fracture network and stress pattern network of the Earth, and they line up a good 80th plus percentile versus random. He's got the charts in this very prescient study that he's put together. Both of those show that a lot of the tectonic motion, a great preponderance of the tectonic motion that we've documented in Earth's geohistory, has come as the result of a rotation between NP and NP prime.
It seems like the North Africa there kind of shows that evidence, but that it sort of explains the washout you see in North Africa on Google Earth.
Absolutely.
explains that a lot
Imikusi.
better than anything else. It's like nothing else can sort of move the water in that direction that you can plainly see in the
Yeah.
Sahara.
Yeah, you really got into get into hand waving, extreme levels of hand waving to dismiss the water destruction. I don't even want to call it erosion, the water destruction pathway, the inundation pathway that cuts through Imikusi Pass. There's a 14,000-year-old volcanic eruption that Jimmy Corsetti has studied, and he highlighted this. And you could see the water cutting through the basalt and the lava flows from that eruption. So it's a water flow that occurred in the last 14,000 years. You can see it cut across Chad and the diatomaceous salt flats that have no tributary infeeds and formed about, believe it or not, 4,400 BCE.
Wow.
And then took a Coriolis turn to the right in the vector of which the water progressed, went off the coast of Mauritania and created what is called the Mauritanian Slide Complex. The largest debris slide complex on the Earth is clearly the result of oceans cascading across the Sahara. The good news about that for the inhabitants of, say, Congo and equatorial Africa was that it saved those cultures at that time from the inundation, because the inundation was coming at them full speed and then all of a sudden took a right-hand turn and went dumping into the Atlantic, and it saved a good deal of the flora, fauna, and humanity that existed in sub-Saharan Africa at the time.
And people don't think about it, but if you looked at North America, would look just like that shit if it wasn't full of trees and is built up and in a vegetative play. Like if North America had ended up on the equator and ended up just being a desert, you would see that same sort of inundation, because we've been lucky enough to follow Randall Carlson around in the field where he's looking at this stuff, where we go to these major landscapes and you can see what is clear evidence of massive amounts of water.
Yes, and it replicates all over the globe. So if you look at the American Southwest, as you just mentioned, Darren, and look at Patagonia, look at the Andean coast of South America, look at the Gobi Desert and its progression through Manchuria and Kamchatka, look at the Botswana Desert, look at the Arabian Gulf, which is the Persian Gulf. The Navy name, or the Saudi name I prefer to use for the Persian Gulf, is the Arabian Gulf. It's clear that the Arabian Gulf is the remnant of, quote, the flood. It's just retracted back into what is now the Persian Gulf. We described the Persian Gulf. You can see that. I've gone through the Saudi empty quarter when I did the pharmaceutical strategy for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. There's nothing there, and it's laid waste, and you can see the ancient shorelines of retraction, just flying over it and walking it. The argument is stark, and nobody pays attention to it. And that water rose to the same level, by the way, as the water rose to in the Imikusi inundation streaks that occur through the Sahara. Why nobody has seen this before is just beyond me. It's obvious. But anyway, that
sounds like a whole other post or a whole other book that you could do there on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is can you explain this? This is just going in a little bit more detail about the stones themselves cry out, right?
Yes, you're going through the article. Those are the ones that have pictures in the article are the ones that I included in the statistical
Right.
analysis.
Yeah.
And I used a Bayesian analysis to just detect the probability given 8 constraints and modifications, and all of them are null hypothesis friendly. In other words, I disadvantaged my conjecture here to the extreme, to an egregious level. I went overboard to disadvantage my argument. And I applied those 8 modifications to the Bayesian math and ran a Poisson analysis that just simply says, what are the odds of all these monuments pointing at the same spot on the globe, by accident? And when it got past 1 times 10 to the 14th, I'd already done the job at that point. It was astronomically small,
Wow.
even advantaging the null hypothesis, which says, hey, this is just accidental. And
Awesome.
that argument has to be in the mix, because it's the null hypothesis, but that argument doesn't hold water. We falsified it. So these monuments are pointing there for a reason. And the ones that are in the statistical analysis are shown in that red line diagram, geodesic diagram right there,
Yeah.
or I forget the term for that, not geodesic, whatever, geodesy, I believe. That outlines the ones that are in the statistical analysis to show that there is consistency. If likewise you take the perpendicular ordinal for each of those monuments and try and map those same red lines to the North Pole, there's incoherence there. And to a navigator, that tells you you've got the wrong ordinal. The right ordinal is the one that passes through Southern Africa.
I was going to ask you about this. I don't know if you're familiar or worked with Mario Build Reps on his team in Europe. The mapping of all these things. They mapped 1,200 of these things as supposedly pointing to those poles.
They are, but they're incoherent. And what he says that the North Pole was south of Greenland, then migrated into Greenland, migrated to another. That migration is the incoherency. That's why Fred Noonan turned the wrong way, because he chose a moving bearing rather than a static bearing and killed both he and Amelia Earhart. They're making the same mistake that Fred Noonan made in his navigation. And as I mentioned, I'm a 40-year navigator. I'm highly experienced at this. What they're doing there is taking the movement in an incoherent ordinal and correcting that by saying, oh, well, the North Pole moved. Well, it didn't. If they had just taken the other ordinal and focused it, they would have found NP prime. Unfortunately, they did not do that. They didn't test all the scenarios like our statistical analysis tests all the ordinal scenarios as part of its diligence. They didn't do that. They made a presumption that it pointed to our current North Pole. If they had taken the perpendicular ordinal, they would have seen the coherence in Southern Africa. That coherence is a 99+% argument that these monuments were pointed at that spot. The effect he sees there is a virtual effect.
And so that, I mean, there's all this mythology about the Garden of Eden being in the North Pole and all that too, and so that Southern African spot used to be where the North Pole was, and it would have been then filled with ice at some point, I guess, right? Is that what you were saying?
Well, I mean, that's just another way of looking at the Garden of Eden, right? It's just the Garden of Eden was at the North Pole, but now it's not.
That's one argument. And we don't know what the North Pole looked like during State 2. It's not a replication of Antarctica or Arctica.
Okay.
No, and this is more of this is when Graham and I are talking about this. This is more of a mythological thing, like the Hyperborean,
gotcha,
or the Iron Republic, where there's sort of it's like their version of Atlantis, where it's like but you can almost read that as being this place that does end up super conducive to life is at the North Pole sometimes. So when they're talking about it, they're like, the place where we used to live is at the North Pole now. It's not great to live there when it's there, but when it's not, it's pretty awesome.
Well, there's several books out that identify some rather ancient activity occurring in mines in that region. And I've done actual mining and mine surveys for several African nations. And read those books at the time just out of side interest. But there is an indication that there is rather ancient activity occurring under the ground in Southern Africa. I contend that that the cleanest fit to the Islamic and if you will, Abrahamic traditions of the Garden of Eden fit what is called Padan Aram. It's the giant garden just south of Göbekli Tepe, which is very simple if you want to use that judgment evaluation technique. It has 4 rivers around it. To the extreme east is the Tigris, to the west is the Euphrates, to the arcing around the land to the east, which would be the land of Havilah, would be the Gihon River, and I've got it mapped in one of my articles. And then flowing through that garden of Padan Aram is the Pishon River. So the 4 rivers outlined in the Bible are right there at Göbekli Tepe, if you map them out and look at them. So that large plateau, it's right at the headwaters, not the headwaters, but it's right upriver from Ur, and supplied, I conjecture, the majority of the fruits and vegetables and grains that were floated downstream to Uruk and the Sumerians. So that's why it was their garden of legend. And I think that area that's why it's so close to Göbekli Tepe, the oldest monument in modern man or man's civilization, is because the origins, if you look at the origins of of much of agriculture and animal husbandry. They all started in the Fertile Crescent. That garden is at the heart of the Fertile Crescent.
Yeah, the book Darren I was thinking of was The Paradise Found, where they reference all these even a lot of science back then pointing to the North Pole for this ancient myth and the Garden of Eden and all that. And I wondered about that. Like if the thing was to shift again, if you'd find a whole bunch of stuff underneath where the North Pole is right now, almost like the legends of
more likely Antarctica. Yeah. I think it's more likely Antarctica because I think under the North Pole is mostly water, unless there's some cool shit in Greenland.
Yes, that's correct. Greenland has some of the accumulation. It's certainly the locus of ice core studies, aside from that ice which is still rafting on the ocean at the North Pole. But yeah, it's mostly water, and that puts some challenge into detecting how it's changed over the eons.
Yeah, because it's almost constantly recycling itself in that state.
That's correct.
Roger, this is great. Is there anything you think we missed? Is there anything we still got to get to?
I think that's it for now. We've got other things that are underway that we'll be publishing on X. They still won't let me, as far as I know, on LinkedIn or YouTube or any of the other or Facebook. Even the mention of my name got comments censored without even making a contention. That sort of human rights crime. We've gotten smart about that over the last 3 years because those people pulled a lot of harmful shenanigans on us. People are getting smart on that. And so I'm going to test the waters with YouTube probably first. I don't go anywhere near LinkedIn because they're still an oppressive institution. So maybe we'll see something come up on YouTube.
Are you excited about the future of this revealing and in general, besides the censorship still going on, but like this administration, like sort of what's happening with, and I don't want to get political necessarily, but just is it sort of, there's been a lot of information about sort of fusion and free energy and also the ancient mysteries and all this stuff seems to be coming out. Are you pretty excited about it in the next couple of years?
Yeah, free energy. I was
not necessarily free, but different energy. Let's say alternative energy.
Yeah. I took it as the equivocal version of that.
Yeah.
I was in nuclear engineering for a period of time and took extensive calculus and nuclear core dynamic classes through the years. One of the things that started out in our beginner nuclear engineering courses was, in 10 years, we're going to have fusion. So prepare yourself in your studies. Here we are. What is it? A century and a half later? No. Here we are 40 years later, and we don't have fusion, and we're not any closer. So I'm skeptical about where our energies head. It's almost as if when we get technologies introduced, they only accomplish two things. They help us fight wars more effectively, or control people more effectively. Aside from that, there doesn't seem to be much interest in improving the lot of humankind. Some medical advances, I have to grant it there, but I don't see a lot of technology that is really making quantum leaps in our use of energy. I'm hoping I'm wrong. And actually, I've done some work in studies that identify some of the elements that are some of the studies and initiatives that are on the horizon in that energy development. But these companies, after working with them, they have a long way to go just yet. And they're on the fringe, and they include some arguments that mainstream science is not going to be able to accept. And that's to the discrediting of mainstream science, because there's a whole horizon here that needs to be developed.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, what about Elon pushing solar and batteries and solar satellites and all that? I mean, that seems to be like that innovation. Like he seems to be able to push that stuff pretty fast.
Yeah, and if we can change the efficiency, the photovoltaic efficiency that we derive out of the solar collectors, that may be a game changer. But as we saw in the winter storm that hit Texas, I was working with an oil client in Texas at that time. It was a disaster in terms of both the immediate utilization of energy in Texas when the ice storms hit, as well as in terms of destruction of the solar and wind infrastructure thereafter. Yeah, it was a problem.
Go for it. Good luck, Elon.
Yeah, good luck, Elon. I mean, Yeah, the X thing did turn out to be a net positive for sure. I mean,
I think so.
I don't know where we'd be right now if it wasn't for that decision. Where it ends up getting us in the end, we'll see. But it definitely has opened up. I mean, even this kind of stuff wouldn't be here if that wouldn't have changed gears when it did. So
I agree with you, Darren.
And Facebook might be opening up. We've heard rumors about it opening up a little bit more. So Facebook might be a place for you to try again too.
Yeah, and coming out of an intelligence background, the caution was don't go on Facebook. So I've stayed away from Facebook. I've done enough work and enough things where I really, and part of the reason to create the Ethical Skeptic was to insulate my family from, I don't want to say my past, that sounds overly dramatic, but anything that could come back. Let's just put it that way.
Well, yeah, we totally get it. Yeah,
absolutely. Roger Cunningham, the Ethical Skeptic. We encourage everyone to follow you on Twitter, now X. Thank you for coming on the show. And when that does happen that we were talking about, that's a secret still, let us know and we'll have you back on the show.
Darren, Graham, it's been an absolute pleasure. Glad to be back on your show again.
Thanks a lot. Awesome. Take care.
Have a good day. And that was a chat with Roger Cunningham, the Ethical Skeptic. Good one. I mean, blowing up on the live, almost 500 people watching live. People excited. So big thanks to Roger for coming on the show. Big thanks to you guys for listening. One of our favorite topics here in Grimerica. What'd you think?
Yeah, it was great. Yeah. Little over my head, trying to grapple with it still. But.
Well, it's interesting because you've read all those old books though. So, at least you know what they were talking about. Big thanks to Roger for coming on the show. Big thanks to those of you who listened. Even bigger thanks if you're one of the 1% who choose to support us and keep the show on the air. If you like the show, you like the podcast, you like the interviews, and you want it to stick around, head over to grimerica.ca/support today. Sign up for a monthly or make a one-time donation, and we'll keep coming at you with no commercials and nothing else. We can't do commercials, so it's like this or nothing. We had our thing this month where we're just going to try and get all you to sign up for $1 a month. If you all sign up for $1 a month, we'll stop asking. Check out AmericaOutlaw.ca for other podcasts. We also had Roger on there a couple years ago. You could find that in the back catalog on that show, talking about strictly COVID stuff. Contact at thecabin.com for trips and events. Like I mentioned, we're going to Malta, Sardinia, Sicily soon. We're going to Easter Island in April. We've got the solstice at Serpent Mound and some Randall Carlson stuff too. People can check that out. Adultbrain.ca for audiobooks. AmericaCBD.com for gummies and tinctures. Other than that, we love you guys. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.